Yeah, I think that that's great. So what I suggest is indeed that we give the floor to Sylvain, who will be, let's say, he will be running the show today. So let's give the floor to him to set up the conversation a bit. And then perhaps as the conversation moves on, we'll let Aida chip in on some of the issues she just raised. And of course, we'll be giving some feedback if there's any questions from participants. We'll have an open Q&A session in the end. But of course, if there's like some questions, please do write them in the chat box, and we'll deal with them as soon as it is convenient. So I think Sylvain, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. So thank you very much for the presentation. So as Giorgio stated, I prepared a little presentation. It may be a little longer than what we need, but it is mainly designed to introduce you to some practices and tools in order to make data journalism open. So we will get back to those terms. So all this presentation will be available, and is already available, as a matter of fact, on our website. It is also available, the sources are on GitHub, and more sources will come. I will get you the full documentation for it, the bibliography, and everything that has been quoted will be available on the GitHub page dedicated to this webinar. So, as I said, Datactivist is an organization designed to help open data and make it useful. So make data open and also reused. And the second part, of course, interests us a great deal today. And first of all, I wanted to know just briefly, maybe if we can open up the mics for a second. What do you expect from this webinar? What do you have in mind? Are there terms, notions, experience that you are interested in or curious of, and that you'd like to address during this conversation? So maybe Giorgio, we can, or maybe through the group chat. As you prefer, by voice or by group chat. Don't know what's better for you.
Não tem bom.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're here, I mean, yeah, so perhaps don't be shy and write a couple of words in the box, in the chat box, if you have some thoughts about like what you expect, if you have a specific idea. Otherwise, I think Sylvain can go ahead.
Okay, so maybe we move on, and later, if you have some comments or specific questions, we may.
It's probably easier that way because we are like about 20 people, and then it gets messy.
Okay, let's move on then.
Yeah.
So, first of all, and that's a question that may sound a little obvious, but that it definitely not is obvious, is what do you mean, I mean, in this case, I mean by open data. So first, finding the data, I'm using some preliminary consideration. Data has many different occurrences and definitions. We will stick to that one that is provided by Rob Kitchen, and it's the idea of abstractions recorded to build knowledge. So Data are anything that is actually recorded. It may include numbers, characters, symbols, images, sounds, electromagnetic waves, bits, weather condition, whatever you want, as far as it is recorded to build knowledge. And that's something very important, is to make a radical difference between data and information. Data is not information. Data conveys bits that can be combined, compared, and computed to produce information. So the pyramid is what you call the Ackoff pyramid. It's attributed to Russell Ackoff in a paper of 1989. And it's the idea that data is the base upon which you build information. Information is required for knowledge, and knowledge for wisdom. And it is important for us as journalists, is that raw data is not enough to cover a topic. Raw data is not enough to make a paper, and we'll see that later on. Now, the idea of open may sound very vague, but it has actually been very much discussed, especially among the groups interested in this matter. Here I'm quoting the Open Knowledge Foundation open definition. So that's one of the definitions that is used currently. And as you may see from right away, it crosses legal and technical consideration, and that will go on. And that's why ethics are in so many ways compatible and paramount to data journalism, is because you always cross techniques with ethics, techniques with justice and legal system. So according to this definition, this is the short version of it. You've got a 5 pages version of it too, if you want to. The link is in the description. Open means anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share for any purpose, subject at most to requirements that preserve provenance and openness. So this is pretty much the absolute definition of open data. This is more of a horizon to go to than the general definition of open data. And to this matter, there's some criteria you can apply to specify the level of openness of whether a single data set or a full government. And you have 8 of them, ranging from the completeness, meaning that you have the complete data available, to the open format, which is more technical, machine readability, which is technical also, and some legal consideration like what we call non-discriminatory. That means that open data, to be fully open, mustn't be available upon registration. That is very important, because in some legal system, in some government, registration is also a way to track the use you make of the data, who downloads it, who uses it, and what for. So the free access to data is also depending on the way you can actually download it and for what purposes. So open data is not only a technical consideration, it's also a political demand. And those criteria give way to evaluation by many organisms of the level of openness. I have here 3 examples. So you've got the Open Data Index, you can see below, which is a ranking of a lot, around 100 territories in the world on the level of openness regarding some specific data and data sets, like weather condition, like air quality, like also national laws, national project laws, etc., etc. And for each of them, you've got, as you can see, a range of green to red, depending on what's open and to what extent, according to the 8 principles quoted a little earlier. You also have the Open Data Barometer, which is made by the Web Foundation, under pretty much the same principle, but with different methodology. And you have the Right to Information rating, which is a little specific because it evaluates the quality of Freedom of Information acts, but not considering the way they are applied. And you have many more. Just look around, you'll find the one you're looking for. But as I said, it's not only a technical consideration, it's a political demand. And this political demand is very much summed up by the December 7th, 2007 meeting in Sebastopol. So Sebastopol is a city in California, which is the headquarters for O'Reilly Edition. As some may know, it's one of the big computer science and computer publisher in the world. You may have heard of many books ranging from HTML and JavaScript stuff to machine learning, algorithm, and very technical stuff. And basically what happened is on this date, there was a meeting of many influencers and activists, web activists, that raised the question prior to the US presidential election of the open government, asking the future president, in this case Barack Obama, to defend a model and to defend the principle of an open government. This open government principle standing on the ground of open data, among other principles. And the key principles of open government data were the one listed on the slide just before. So as I said earlier, it's not only technical stuff, it's also a political fight. And this actually led to the development of the Open Government Partnership that was launched by the President Barack Obama during a UN meeting, and that we'll mention a little later on. So why use open data as a journalist? That's a question I'm asked pretty often, but I decided to address it through the good reason to use it and the bad reason not to use it. So first, good reason, it's becoming more and more common. I've been working in many places and training journalists and NGO activists to use open data, and especially in Western Africa, French-speaking Africa. And the common problem I faced was people not believing there were actually open data in their country. You have proof just on the next slide that even if in the least expected country, you can find open data and quality open data. In fact, you've got a global integration process going on with the Open Government Partnership, with access to information laws being voted in a lot of territories. You got 79 countries that actually committed to action plan for open government, including open data publication, and 20 local governments you can find on the OGP page that is freely accessible, and the links are in the description. The Open Knowledge Foundation provides a wide coverage of the available data by administration and types for 94 places. That's the same kind of categories as earlier across the world. So the first advice I can give you is just to check for your country, check for your community. You've got big cities, you've got regions such as Catalonia who have those kind of roadmaps, and those roadmaps are actually usable and actionable for journalists looking for open data. The second reason is that it makes people accountable. When you use open data, you're actually quoting someone's word, and this word is the producer's word. When you use open data to check or analyze the action, the declaration, structure of an organization, whatever it is, you have two options in front of you. The people question have two options. One, they react and comment on the fact that you expose. And second, they correct the data. So by using the data they provide themselves, you actually confront people to what they publish, to what they quote, and you confront them with data, not with out of context quotes that you may use in other ways. So it's, of course, only if you actually open your method. If your method is not public, you can be questioned on your methods. But if your method is public, then the discussion comes on the data, so on the fact that are exposed by the organization you're talking about. You can see on the right an analysis of the public tenders contract types by a fellow journalist from Burkina Faso, Gaston Bonheur Sawadogo, who I trained and who actually applied the principle of data journalism applied to open data to his country. And he identified trends in the rise of direct agreements in the public tenders after the democratic transition. The graph you see below is actually made from one contract per line database that was made available by the Burkina Faso government. And it helped him actually track the trends and actually spot the possible conflict of interest and corruption cases that were going on in country, and the sectors that were the most concerned by those kind of direct agreements. So the reason number 3 is that it makes you accountable. And that to me is very important because it's a matter of credibility. A lot of the criticism that goes to journalism today lies in the distance it puts between the public and its sources. It's common thought to be discussed that journalists are too close to power, too close to the official version, etc., etc. Using open data and opening new data allows you to produce your conclusion and the pieces you use to come to it. I decided to quote a very interesting line from Aliom Leroy, who works for the BBC in Africa, and who eventually works mainly on open sources. And I quote, "If the BBC tells you they've got a source that proves this, the BBC is the middleman and the source is behind it. You can't see it." And this position of being between the source and your public is actually the position raising question among the public. On the other hand, and as it stands, if you've got the visual evidence, there is no middleman. You connect directly to the evidence. He here talks mainly about open source investigation and using open source materials such as Wikipedia or social networks and Google Maps and other stuff of the sort, but it applies perfectly to open data, as open data is lying around ready to be checked by the public himself. So now let's go to bad reason not to use open data. And the first and one of the most interesting is there's nothing interested in open sources. So that's the common secrecy and mystification passion of our good profession, is if it's open, it's worthless. A piece of information lying on the ground can be worth your attention. What can be found free in freely available data? And the idea is based on this misconception I raised earlier, that data are facts, or these some truth by themselves that only need to be published to be known. And in fact, data made available is just raw material. You need to piece it together. You need actually to make the jigsaw a whole, to read between the lines and to get the fabric into and make a piece out of it. So with good definition and comprehension of an issue, mundane data can actually answer big questions, and we'll see many examples later. So for example, I don't know how many of you, oh, you don't hear me well. Do you hear me better here? Should I speak louder? That's Laura asking.
It's okay for me.
Okay, thank you. So I hope you've seen Spotlight. So first, because it's a good movie, and then because it's actually a good example. I use it pretty often in my data journalism class because, as some may have actually understood, this is documentary on open source investigation. So sorry for the spoiler, but the investigation held by the journalist in Spotlight regards the sexual assaults by priests in Boston region and Boston area in the US. And at some point in the movie, they realized that they would need to get the list of the people that may be responsible of those abuses. And in fact, they realized that clergymen use some code words to get those priests out of the system long enough to be forgot. And they realized that one of the biggest data sources they have is not just door knocking, it's actually big registers in the basement of the Boston Globe. So they go down, they take up the register, and they begin to actually go through every single page, finding out who did what, who was moved where, and under what pretext. As you can see here, it's basically spreadsheet journalism, but that is the start of data journalism. And the source is here in the basement from the beginning of the movie. Sorry for the spoilers, but you can watch it anyway. It's a good movie, and it's a good movie about journalism and about good journalism. So, second bad reason not to use open data: anyone can steal my news. So here again, I dare to point out two misconceptions that are, to me, that lead to this, this fear. The first is that the over-reliance of journalism closed source is pretty much, I wouldn't say a thing from the past, but doesn't apply to many topics. One of my first editor-in-chief told me sometimes all you need to make a good investigation is the phone number of the Attorney General. But in fact, it's the case if you don't have some technical skill that open many doors. And that is very important, because once you consider journalism is a technical job, you realize that you can actually learn skills that make you less reliant on outside and closed sources. The second misconception to me is that journalists own their stories. Topics in debate aren't no one's property, and put in another way, it's everyone's property. So what can you steal that nobody owns? That's a good question to ask. If you have the answer, please send me an email, because that would be, I think, too long for the chat. But anyway, the idea to just take advantage of what's open and make it relevant to anyone is a good way not to get your ID stolen, because the best way not to get something stolen is actually to make it public as soon as possible. It's also a way to protect you. And the third bad reason is it's too complicated. And well, it's 4:30 now, so we've got 1 hour left to prove you wrong on this one. And the final reason I'd like to raise is that open data as a movement shares many values with journalism in general. You've got the freedom of information, accountability, public empowerment. And improving open data policy as itself is linked to improvement of information quality. So those demands and this political fight is already embraced by strong communities that some of us are already working with in our subject, like in our topics, like hackers, researchers, social justice organizations. They can be allies in this search, and actually they can help build pressure on governments to make data available, useful data and important data available. To make it short and to quote some wise men, open data is a fight for journalists too. So you can join in.
I think that's a lot of good points you made, Sylvain, and I like the particular the political dimension of it also. The idea that, I mean, it's open data, it's journalism, but I mean, having data open, it's a way, you know, to, let's say, call on the authorities, for example, to elaborate on those data and to you know, get a better base for journalism. I wonder if Aida has something to add on this front.
Yeah, so we've thought about this a lot as an organization from the perspective of ethics, because for us, it all goes back to thinking about questions of independence, transparency, and thinking about the consequences of the work that we are doing. And this sort of debate between open and closed data for us is very much one about ensuring that you are using data to provide accurate and independent news and information rather than furthering someone else's agenda. And that can work both ways. That can work with open data, it can work with closed data. But it's just as a journalist, as a data journalist, being aware of that, being aware of the consequences of everything that you do at every stage in the process. In the course that we've produced, we have a section on the sort of virtues of open versus closed data. And in the course, what we do is we use testimonies from a number of different data journalists. And a couple of them, one of them who works in Tunisia, for example, prefers to work with closed data because open data that she might receive from government sources in Tunisia has its own agenda and has its own, there's a reason why that data has been provided. And although there's a way that you can work with that data to ensure that your story is providing the narrative that you want to provide, there are still some issues for her with working with government provided data or government issued data in the context of somewhere like Tunisia, for example. So for us, it just, again, there's no right or wrong. And this is the thing with everything that we do in terms of thinking about the sort of ethical principles and dimensions of what you're doing. It's not about what's right and what's wrong. It's about determining, it's about being transparent. So if you are working with closed data, being transparent as you can be about the sources of your data and the processes by which you analyzed and cleaned up your data, for example. And then when you are working with open data, it's also about transparency. So it's also about being sure that you have interrogated the method by which the data is shared and the circumstances under which they are shared, for example, as well. So for us, it goes back to the consequences of everything that you do, and it's that by which you then make your decision, your ethical decision as a journalist.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, the fact that if you look into, I mean, if you do a lot of your work based on open data, then you, of course, you're giving some power to the people who provide those data. But on the other hand, I think, and it's one of the issues that emerged also from Sylvain's presentation, is that by using open data, I mean, you can make explicit all those steps. So I think it's, in a way, it's easier to reason on this. Let's say, okay, I'm using open data and this is the source and this is the way I got them. And there's like some issues involved, but by making transparent the whole process, then, you mean, you're still
absolutely
open some space for questioning that and for letting the reader, let's say, in a way, engage and understand better. So it's anyway, it's still more unmediated, if that's a distinction that Sylvain was trying to make, I think, in a way.
Yes, and as I say, we for us, there's no right or wrong. It is just about journalists being enabled to make the decision about the data that they're using and how they communicate that with their audiences and their readers, basically. Yeah.
So Sylvain, I'll give the floor back to you. If you have some comments on this or if you want to proceed, up to you. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You can proceed. Yes, it's fine for me.
Yeah, I'll actually get back to sharing your method and the advantage of it. So it will be in line, I guess. So second part, how to find open data. Well, I'd like, I'm sorry for this long slide, but it's important. There's no one size fits all solutions. I've seen that we have colleagues from many countries, from Europe, from the US, even from Asian countries. And I'd like this presentation to be cross-border, so anyone can refer to it and actually find useful bits and methods. So instead of one big solution, I'll give you practices specific to open data, data journalism practices made possible by open data and open ways to do data journalism. And I will raise here and there values that are important to some communities, some borrowed to research, hacker, and free culture, like reproducibility, collaboration, and sharing. So this caution made. So first case scenario, the data is open and it's available. So you're pretty lucky. Pick your source and proceed. What you'll have to do next is just source your data. To find open data, you've got many ways to actually document it and dig it out. The first solution is, of course, to go firsthand. The nicest way and the easiest way to go is actually to see what did your government pledge to do. So for that, you've got the Open Data Action Plan and Roadmap you can find on the OGP website. You've got sometimes one-stop shop for government's open data, like data.gov.uk. You've got, of course, the US equivalent of it, and you have in most of the EU countries. And what you can do also is poke around in the agencies, secretaries, administration. In the publication, it sometimes requires a little search, but it usually pays off. The other solution is to go to secondhand data. And I will raise here an important fact that is pretty often forgotten, is that not many big data portals, such as the UN portals, the FAO portal, the World Bank, the EU, etc., produce actual data. Most of the time, they're just gathering data from other sources. If you go behind every data set in the metadata, you will get the sources in pretty precise shape. For example, in the World Bank of data, if you go to the website of the data bank, you will be provided with an actual full CSV or XML of metadata, where you'll find for each indicator and for each country how it was actually gathered from what administration and during what period of time. That is, of course, a way to get back to the first-hand data. The other option is to go in a more searcher approach, and that is looking at the bibliography of scientific publication and the public reports on the topic search. The classic stuff is you see a great graph on a public report of an audition or a parliamentary hearing, and you're wondering where the hell that has come from. Well, usually the bibliography will point to you the first-hand source, and it is usually open data provided, whether by the statistics administration or the bureau or some ministry in charge of looking at some topic. And then you can go meta. You have a couple of websites that actually provide you this kind of search, but let's have a look at the Google Public Data Explorer. It's pretty new. It covers a wide range of languages and countries, which is pretty practical compared to the other that are more focused on English. But you may find a couple of stuff around that can be useful. So second case, you have data that is open, meaning available, here not fully open, but is not usable. That's a classic problem you can face, as open data is often just published as it is provided by the administration. So you end up with PDFs, with data spread across multiple files of different formats, stuck in website, and so on and so forth. So in this case, you'll have to piece it all together into usable format. So you'll have to refine the data, you'll have to share the data, share the method, document it, and source. We'll see later some good ways to do that in an efficient and reproducible way. Case number 3, it should be open, but it's not. The Freedom of Information Act and Open Government Act states pretty precisely what data should be open or not. But sometimes something went wrong. You've got years missing in time series, you get specific data regarding a topic that aren't included. Classical stuff is you've got some delay in the publication of data on an economical sector that went on strike, or that wasn't covered properly by the Statistics Administration, or to some extent, some part of the administration didn't comply to the law. So here you have go from diplomacy to full red tape, meaning you'll have to actually check what you can ask for and the ways you can do. We'll see this further through through the methods of filing a demand. And of course, here you'll have to share the data, document and source all of it. Case number 3 is not open, but it can be found. So, as you have seen a lot of time recently, it's what happens when you get leaks, when you've got paper trails that you actually didn't scan or anything. It's one of the problems of the endless digital storage delusion is that you get used to keep everything around. So when you have a leak, it's not just the 2 or 3 relevant documents, it's piles and piles of paper you have to go through. So here we'll use a term, a computer term I'll get back to, which is the compiling process. And the compiling process faces many challenges. First, finding ways to share the data respectfully of the people involved, then finding ways to get the data understandable from the outside in, meaning if you make this data available, people not knowing the topic in the beginning should be able to go through it. And third, how to make a bridge between the data you released and the story you publish. You'll have, of course, then to share the data, share the meta, document, and source. So now that we've gone through those cases, I'll get to the methods involved. And first of all, I've got one large and very technical recommendation is to muscle your opening skill. It may sound a little strange, but actually you've got some practices that are very, very specific to the open data community, but of course that are borrowed from other sectors, such as the hacker community, the free culture, the research. If you talk with scientists, they will not be surprised by what I will mention here, but it's very important because opening data needs interoperability. This means that any system can be brought to another computer, another operating system, and be used properly without data loss. To do this, you actually have a couple of ways to ensure that your data will not be an issue to those wanting to actually look at it and reuse it in their own way. So my first advice would be to get on Git. So I don't know if most of you have been hearing of it. Git is actually a system designed to collaborate and keep track of the modification of programs. It was initially made up by people in charge of developing operating system and open operating system, which is a huge hustle that needs a lot of backtracking, of modification, of contribution. The idea is that Git gives you a framework and some codes and modus operandi to make easy following those modifications and actually contributing. It's actually used to many other stuff different from coding, like you can find vegetarian recipes, you can find the law code of the District of Columbia, and obviously data. It is used by a lot of platforms. The two better known are GitHub and GitLab. This presentation, as I told you, is actually available on GitHub. Giorgio also has a GitHub repository where he puts a lot of his own code. GitLab is more an open source version of it. GitHub is actually a company that was bought by Microsoft a couple of months ago. And you also have some association and organization deploying their own Git platforms such as Frama-Git. Those platforms only host projects. So you can store your project on those platforms and then inviting people to contribute to them and follow the evolution of the project. So if you need references, NightLab brought together many resources on it. So for Git for journalists and Pointer 2. Git is also supported by all the operating systems in the market and all text editors such as Sublime Text or RStudio. So Git will be your way to actually publish and make your work improvable by other people. Then my second advice would be to begin to write in Markdown. So Markdown is a styling syntax that is used in GitHub and a lot of programming projects. Basically what it does is that Markdown is allows you to make many styling efforts such as emphasis, lists, link, etc., without modifying your text too much. It's very much readable. If I was to show you, for example, the code of this presentation, you would find it, I guess, pretty, well, not straightforward maybe, but readable in plain English, if I may. So this is a webinar page. And if I go here, I can look at the Markdown file of the presentation, and you can see here the styling. So this is just a level 3 title. This is to get some paragraph on the left. This is to get on the right. This is to insert an image, etc. So it's very easy to handle, and it's very easy to modify some already written text to be put in Markdown. What is interesting with Markdown is that it allows you to edit text in a very light way that can be read by most of the programming languages you will use, and also it allows you to publish on many platforms seamlessly. GitHub uses Markdown, this presentation uses Markdown, JavaScript, Python. Most of languages can actually embed Markdown, as some websites too. You can find some CMS using Markdown to edit. And my third advice would be to move to open formats. So when you're in open data, what you actually care about is the data. You don't care about the commented cells, the shiny colors, the drop-down menus and stuff. No, it works fine without Excel spreadsheets. So you can drop your Excel spreadsheets right away and get to more user-friendly and, once again, interoperable formats, and especially two open formats that are commonly used and you can find on most of the open data platforms, which are the CSV and the JSON. CSV stands for comma separated values. It's a gold standard for computer data. Actually, if I was to look into your computer, I will find many CSVs that held your password, your private information, etc. It's very light. It's just separating data with commas and separating observation with new line. Then it's perfect for what we call flat data set, meaning something with one observation per line and one variable per column model. That's a classic tabular data you've been using through Excel, and that you will drop as soon as you find out how powerful CSV is. The JSON is some raising format. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it is very useful when you want to call data not by row name, but row number and column number, but instead with keys. For example, if we were to make a data set of the people participating in this class, in this webinar, we could actually make some field with a key called name and call for the names and having everything published, every name printed in the page. And that's pretty much what's actually happening in Zoom when I look at the list of the participants. So once you've moved to CSV and JSON, you can be sure that any computer program, except Excel, can use your data sets, and that any computer language can actually handle them. So that's a way to ensure that what you will do will be accessible to anyone. And now, what do you do?
Sorry if I interrupt you a second, Sylvain. I think one interesting point, because you went quite straight into the technicalities, so I'm sure that like for some folks it might be somewhat like, I think it's worth like highlighting again why we need, let's say, Git, Markdown, and all the other. And if I may sum it up, if I understand it well, and of course you can then comment back, I think it's the issue of being able of, let's say, sharing a procedure. Because if I, let's say, okay, I use like Excel and copy paste some files, and then I change, delete some codes or do some filtering, it's difficult then to explain to others what exactly did they do. So just I opened like a web page and I did copy paste into an Excel and then change something. So the whole process is not understandable. So I think the one point I would highlight is the importance of actually sharing the whole procedure in a way that is transparent, understandable, and to the extent that is possible, future-proof. So CSV files have been readable for, well, many years, and hopefully they will remain readable for quite a while in the future. And then a second aspect, I think it's among the type of open data we had before. You mentioned the open but not usable data, or almost open data, which is a huge issue in open data or in data journalism in general, that you have all those data in odd formats. And any data journalist, when they see like a data in a CVS file, they will just be very thankful.
Yeah, that's something very, very important indeed, and you're right to stress it, is that when you get an Excel sheet, you don't know what has been done with it, you don't know what's interesting in it, and sometimes you may lose a lot of time just getting the people the right version of your Excel sheets. With CSV, you see right away what's wrong, what's not, etc., etc. So but that may come a little more obvious in the coming slides. So I'm proceeding. First thing, very important, you have to check when you get to open data. That may sound paradoxical, but what can you do with it? Because one of the ways that some governments and administration actually make roadblock on your way is just by shrinking and blocking you from doing some stuff through the licensing. So be sure what you can do, and the license actually sums up your rights on this. When you see Creative Commons, it's not enough by itself. It just means that it fits some values, but it actually needs some extra words or letters to be defined and to tell you and provide you the information you need to know what you can do. Some of the most important are the attribution. So do you have to quote the first author, the producer? How you quote it? Do you have to quote it at every level of the reuse? Then the sharing, can you share it with another license? Do you have to share it to the same license? The $sign is for, do you allow the reuse of this data for commercial purposes? And when I say commercial purposes, one very important thing is, if you have ads on your website, that is commercial purposes. So only if you use it in a non-commercial way, you can actually use what we call NC, non-commercial data license data. Then you've got the clause of modification, remix, and many on. For a quick reference, if you have ODBL license, you're pretty safe with anything. If you have a doubt, you can check a very useful guide to reuser made by Open Data Initiative, the ODI, which is a transnational project that provides you with many guides, informations, tools, and tips for using and reusing open data. So quick quality check. I will skip it because we are a little late. How do you file a demand? That's very important part of the job, because actually, even if a lot of data is available and usable as it is on the web, sometimes you will find the holes pretty quick. Of course, and especially if you're if you're specialized in the matter and you know the topic very well, you will find out that some years are missing, that some files are not where they should be, etc., etc. So my main advice would be to go for the goodwill. Consider that the administration is actually doing its best to do what the law stands. It should have forgotten something. It's just an error of sometimes. So the first thing I advise you to do is actually to thank you for the extra delay. The first thing you could do is actually to get in contact with the administration. You clearly state what the data you're looking for, the reason you believe they exist, and why they should be available, and describe the reason you need. Basically, you send an email stating the data, why you think it exists. Usually it's as simple as, I've seen it quoted in a report, or the minister of blah, blah, blah of Homeland Security said it has data on this topic and I couldn't find it on your website. And then you just said that you actually are looking for information on the state of security on this territory. Of course, you don't go right away to trying to find proof that you're actually harassing some social justice activists. So that's for the form of it. Classic mail will do fine. One of the things I can't stress enough is that you specify a due date. And once you've specified a due date, you actually get some leverage, only some leverage, because most of the efficiency of it would be the way that the administration handles those kind of demands. And the other is, how well do you know the administration? That's why I can't actually tell you how much you have to wait. Usually, the practice is you wait for half of the due date, then you send a second mail to say, well, did you get my first mail, etc., etc. And on the due date, you actually send a mail to give a little extra time for the answer, saying that you will eventually come to the legal ways of obtaining this data through the Freedom of Information Act. And that's the second part. That is where the red tape comes. So Freedom of Information Act usually describes the procedure you are allowed. And in most of the countries, journalists actually have a very clear tutorial on the FOIA, the administration in charge of the FOIA provides you with some guidelines. Three main things: you know who to contact, you have legal delays, so depending on the country, depending on the administration, it can be weeks, it can be months, it can be years. And you have the necessary steps. One of the steps that you may need to have is to actually have a formal no from the administration. That's only a proof of goodwill, meaning that you don't rush to the legal procedure and do unnecessary demand, and you actually ask politely and diplomatically to the administration in charge before going to the legal proceedings. And whatever you do, and that's very important, and I will say it again and again, always keep tracks, records, and copies of what you send to whom and when, because you can be asked at any time during the process to recreate and retell the timeline of your demands. You can be asked, when did you ask to this administration? When did you send this email, etc., etc. It's very important to keep track at any moment. You have some shortcuts and tips that can prove useful. First of it, you have actually good administration giving you tips. The US National Archive actually summed up some advices for FOIA filling. And in this case, you got a special part dedicated to journalists and what they should know about FOIA, about the time it requires, etc., etc. Here you have standard. Agencies have 10 calendar days to grant or deny requests, etc., etc. So sometimes goodwill actually is not fiction. Before you go on the administrative path, which can be long and which can take a lot of time and efforts, be sure that no one has asked for the very same data before. For this, you have many ways to get the information. The first one is just calling the administration. They usually have some communication services to answer your calls. And in some cases, and I'm glad to say that France actually has this kind of interesting feature, the administration in charge, which is called the CADA, Commission d'accès aux documents administratifs, publishes its own rulings in open data. So you can see here, you got the CSV, 218 downloads. So if I was to look around and see what has been asked and the answer that was provided, I could eventually dig in and see in the whole history of the process, or just in shorter periods, as you can see here, all the decisions made and the rulings that were published. And the last but not least, you can work with people, get in team and go around if people, journalists, or maybe association, maybe NGOs, maybe some social workers, and maybe sorry, I'm looking for my words here. Anyway, someone may be interested in the same data. Someone may be interested in the same data and have made the proceeding before you. So just try to keep track of it. And one of the easiest way is just to get in contact with the organizations that are specialized. And here I think of the Open Knowledge Foundation chapters. You have in pretty much all the countries that are represented today, that I'm sure of. And in some countries, they even have put in line some fast tracking process to get more direct and efficient way to ask for open data. We actually worked with Datactivist in improving this process for France. So document, that's what I said earlier. I'll get back to this, but keep track of everything you do every time, and we'll see later how to publish it. Then, second step, once you have your work and once you have your data, you will probably have to refine it. So on the top part of this slide, you will see a classic, which is some World Bank data with a very interesting amount of columns that actually are variables. It's just the actual CO2 emission in metric tons per capita per country per year, but the years aren't here in columns, in lines, actually in columns, which makes the treatment and the visualization particularly painful. So you'll have many of those problems for the reason I quoted earlier. Problem of format, of naming, categories, etc., etc. There are many reasons for that. Sometimes you just have some categories that were renamed across administration, for example. Sometimes you'll just have some computer program change in an administration. For example, you move from Microsoft Excel to LibreOffice, and so you change the format and it is a mess in your data. But compiling, whatever. Data wrangling is a hustle. There was a good New York Times paper I advise you to read that evaluate to 50 to 80% of the time of the data journalist and data scientist, the time dedicated to actually clean the data. And that's why I advise you strongly to get your data wrangling routine, because 99% of the data sets retrieved in open data we require you to actually do the same thing. You don't have one method for it, but you can actually list what you do, what you need to do, what you usually do, and sum it up into a good method. Regarding this, I advise you an excellent post from Data Wrappers, Liz Charlotte Rost, called How to Prepare Your Data for Analysis and Charting in Excel and Google Sheets. So that's my goodwill. I'm even quoting blog posts talking about Excel spreadsheet. And she actually looks up at what you have to do 90% of the time. And she tells you in what order to do it and how to get your checklist done before getting to the manipulation, calculation, etc., with animated GIF, which is to me some proof of quality. But usual steps you will encounter times and times again are the cleaning of the strings. For this, I advise you to use OpenRefine. You will often need to reformat columns and lines. R and Python are great for that, but you can also deal with it in OpenRefine and Google Spreadsheet. Classical stuff you can complete with extra data, like linking some zones and communities to their geographical data, whether they are points or geometries to make maps, and some reference data sets. For example, the World Bank lending groups, there's a specific post on the Data Help Desk that tells you how to use it. That's very useful, especially to rank the countries in region, income, and lending categories. And you have to standardize categories. This work is very, very demanding, and that's why it can be sometimes very useful to actually, I'll get back to that later, share the data once you've cleaned it, share the data once you've refined it. So share the data, of course, and sometimes share the method. Just those little chunks of code you will actually, yes, I'll get back to you, Lorenzo, later. Once you've done your chunk of code, cleaning those World Bank data, some people will actually be glad if they can retrieve it. So share the data, but share the method. We'll get back to that. To answer you, Lorenzo, the webinar will be accessible through our GitHub pages. We have a GitHub repo I quoted earlier. It's on the Datactivist webpage, and it's over here where you have, so the whole README, the documentation with the sources, references, bibliography, and you actually have the full webinar slides here available in HTML. So feel free to look it up. I will update it later on after we get the Q&A. So one other task you may need to do is actually compile the data. If the data is not machine readable, meaning that your computer can make calculation and visualize it by itself, it may be human readable that you can sum up in HR if you actually are a robot. And maybe it can be scrapped from a source. So conversion from non-machine readable format to tabular format is a useful task that can reveal a lot of very interesting things. You can make machine readable public archives, corporate documents, handwritten notes, etc., etc. And the term for it in computer programming, this task of translating something into machine language, is referred to as compiling. And compilation actually makes you not the author, but the host of very important data, even when this data has been acquired through very classical means like door knocking or archive consultation. One of my favorite example is actually a very old stuff. It's 2010. It's the Las Vegas Sun, which is a daily from Las Vegas, so covering the whole Nevada state, US state. And the Do No Harm project started from the lack of transparency in the hospital quality in Nevada region. No transparency, no accountability. So the journalist actually decided to go and knock not on doors, but on hospitals, hospital doors and emergency room to go through the patient records. They actually did it in full, whether it was scanning process or by hand, and they reported line by line, case by case, every single instance they found here, meaning infections, injuries, bad treatment, etc., etc. And they actually get the categories from the doctors themselves. So it was a very precise compilation of data. And so part of it has actually been closed, but as you can see here, they were able to sum it up and to actually make very comprehensive calculation of the rate of injuries and surgical site infection, for example, by hospital in the greater Las Vegas area. So this is something that was actually impossible before they compiled the data. So by compiling the data, you are actually improving the level of information of the community and of the public on specific topic by compiling those data. So the way to share...
Wait a second, Sylvain, I think I'll give you like maybe like 1 minute to take a breath, and I'll pick it up again with Aida, if she's here with us, because I was thinking that one of the issues that came out again and again during your talk was the issue again of like taking the data, refining them, which again goes back to the fact that data, even the one that looks open, they may not be fully open, and sometimes they're half open, let's say. But what is often the case is that you find yourself like scraping data, for example. So the data have not been, published, meant with like a clear license, and you just have to ask yourself, but can I take them? Or so you scrape them for your journalism, you probably have a reason to do that. Sometimes and then can you make them public? And then that's the part of the sharing you get into. But was wondering if there's some thoughts that Aida may want to share about this almost open data or alternative ways of getting data, and if there's some consideration that we should include, let's say, in these kind of activities.
Yeah, sure. So a few things came to my mind when I was listening to Sylvain's excellent presentation, actually. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that, again, if we think about the principles that guide more traditional forms of journalism and how they might apply in the context of data journalism, one thing that we need to be clear on is that good, impartial, independent journalism relies on a diversity of sources and a number of different sources. So if we are working with one set of data or one set of open data, it's worth thinking about then what other sources we can access that might complement that data when we're coming to actually work on our story. The second thing that also came to my mind was these issues around cleaning and managing data, because this is actually one of the sort of main places where issues around accuracy and losing accuracy of data might actually occur. So when you're working with large data sets, there's an issue at source of verifying your data, whether it's open or closed or whatever. But I mean, also there's an issue around working with different sets that have been shared in different ways, and ensuring when you're cleaning and merging and analyzing those sets of data together, that you're not analyzing two very different sets of data using the same factors of analysis, if you like, basically. So again, it's about ensuring that accuracy lies at the heart of everything you do, and you don't lose that as you're starting to merge very large different sets of data that have been acquired from different sources. So again, it's about ensuring that the checks and balances are in place throughout the cleaning and management of and scraping process of working with data. Again, the other thing that I was thinking about was this sort of principle of transparency and how much you should tell your reader or your audience and how you make that decision. You know, and again, for us, it comes back to consequences. And if you think that there might be an occasion where you are working with a set of data where you cannot be 100% transparent about the sources and management and access to some of that data, but you feel that that data provides a very important angle to a particular story, then it's all about ensuring that you are as transparent with your audience or your reader or whoever's engaging with your narrative about why you're unable to give them 100% transparency around the source of that data. There's a really interesting website in Spanish website called Publico, and they do a lot of data journalism work, and they have a transparency button on all of their stories. And so it's not, and basically what it does is it rates each story according to transparency. And what they're doing with that is they're not necessarily saying that we need to be 100% transparent about everything that we do and everything that we source and all of the data that we're using and how we've accessed it and how we're cleaning it, or et cetera, but it is about saying that where I can't be transparent, I'm aware that I've not been transparent and I'm sharing that with you, the reader, and then the reader or audience have agency and are allowed to make up their mind about how they then process the story.
Yeah, I think this is a great point, and again, it's all part of this process of gaining the trust of the reader, making journalism that people can trust. So I mean,
Absolutely.
this insistence on transparency, I think, is an absolutely great point. So if you haven't anything to add, more to add at this stage, let's have Sylvain go ahead with this talk.
Okay.
Thank you very much. You're right to raise those questions, because that's unfortunately one of the part that I won't have the time to go deep enough in, is the ethics of data and the potential as well as the importance of questioning the data. I'm used to say that open data is like an interview. You actually have to ask questions to the data. You actually have to know why it is published. As you said, sometimes using open data is just pushing someone's agenda, and sometimes it has been even more problematic than that, as some data from the get-go actually specify the limits they have, which is very important, and in the other, and even with this specification, some colleagues actually publish it without raising those questions and addressing this very topic that those data aren't fit to describe. I just give an example that is to me very striking, because I live in Paris, well, in the greater Paris area, and I'm riding a bike. So as I'm riding a bike in Paris, I've made 3 stops in the 5 last year in the hospital, because I have traffic accidents and was injured. And the thing is that when you look at the data from traffic accidents in France, physical casualties, deaths, but also people going to the hospital after a traffic accident, you may think that actually cyclists are pretty safe on the French roads. But it is something that you may only think if you don't read the material, the metadata in the introduction that specify pretty clearly from the first paragraphs that the bike casualties are under recorded because a lot of cyclists don't press charges because of hit and run by the cars. So even with this level of specification, a lot of people actually publish papers on, oh, look, the biking incidents are actually very low, so cyclists are safe. And I can tell you from what I know and the discussion I have with Cyclist Association, cyclists are not safe in Paris, but that's the illusion you may have if you don't read the specification you have in introduction of the metadata of these physical accident data sets. So getting back to the presentation, I wanted to show you a way of sharing the data that I found very interesting and that crosses some topics we raised earlier. Is a colleague, a data journalist, Alexandre Lechner, who published an investigation on the GAFA MOOC. So GAFA MOOC is GAFA with Microsoft, Uber, and Twitter in the EU. And he did this investigation by compiling data from open sources. Once visualized, he decided to actually make the CSV with the listing of the meetings, the topics that were raised during this meeting, and the administration involved into CSV. And he used his GitHub page to actually make those data available. So if I go on it, you can see here you've got lobbies, you got the Rencontre Europe, so it's the meeting in Europe. And if I click on it, I can see that you have the host, first host, no, yeah, it's a little, so that's a reference CSV. And you have here the lobbies. So that's the analysis of the number of people working for each, the budget every year, and the page to the register holding those data in plain in a classic form. And then you have here the meetings that were actually held, with whom, which company, what position, beginning, the end, etc., etc. And as you see, when you put CSV in GitHub, it gives you some formatting that makes it easier to read. And of course, at the end of every line, you've got a column with the source that specifies. So you've got LinkedIn, you've got Twitter, you've got some articles from Le Monde, the daily. And as you see, you get many ways to compile those data from different sources. And GitHub can just be your open data platform. So another way to do is actually to go to what we call the community resources. So I will get to the data.gouv.fr, which is our website, and our website, the website of the French government for publishing open data. And here is the register for companies in France. So it's the full register of all the companies that are registered to the National Institute of Statistics, which is requirement by the law. And as you can see, those are very heavy files. You've got the, this is the last stock version of it. It's 116 megaoctets. And here you got 1.2 gigs, and it raises up to even more, if I'm right, 4 gigs. So it's huge document. But some information actually lack, among which you only have the address in postal format. So you have the name of the street, the number of the street, etc., postal code. And actually, you get here what is called ressources communautaires, so community resources. And some people, the first thing they did was actually to geocode those data to be able to spot on a map with XY coordinates every single line being one company on a map in France. So that's very useful, and that of course spares you a lot of work, and it's a way also to share. And as you may see, at least on the French Open Data portal, it's put pretty much forward in the contribution. So it's always also a way to make your work known. So the last thing you can do once you've done, you went all through those steps, is actually compute. I gathered here some example because as I said earlier, sometimes you may think that open data only helps you answer silly questions like what is the road with the most traffic, on what day to get married in order to have the least chance to get rain, etc., etc. But actually, by using some methods, you can answer very technical questions. For example, and that's the only time I promise I will quote a work I did myself, you can translate your problematics into code and use this code to answer big questions like CCFD Terre Solidaire and Sherpa, which are two French chapter of international NGOs that were wondering how well was the CSR law applied in France. There was a law that was voted on March 27th in France that March 27, 2017, so 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, that actually pressed and asked from companies above a given number of employees, maybe, so to make it short, it was 5,000 employees in France or 10,000 employees in the whole world, to publish some document on their social impacts, human rights risks, environmental risks, etc., etc. The problem is that the legislator actually said, well, we trust the goodwill of the company that will eventually declare themselves and publish the documents by themselves. Surprise, there were something like 40 plans that were published with different level of details, but it was very, very low. The thing is that we didn't know how much it was, for we didn't have the list of the companies that were supposed to publish in the first place. So what we did was we went on with the register of companies, the public register of companies. We used 3 of them, Sirene, Infograph, a private one called Orbis, and the list actually made by hand by the 2 NGOs, CCFD Terre Solidaire and Sherpa. And what we realized is that actually there weren't 2 registered that had the same number of employees for the same company. Well, we had 2 that went past the threshold that was required to publish those documents. And in the end, we could publish a full 237 eligible companies that make the criteria of the law, and we could compare it to the list of the company that actually published those plans. So we made those companies accountable, as the law didn't make them accountable by not giving us a full list. And this is now a website. Surprising, I didn't put it here. You have a website that was set up called Plan Vigilance, and when you can actually look at the list of the companies, on the left you got the name of the companies, and on the right you've got the CSR plans and documents that were required. And as you may see, most of them actually didn't publish them. And the list is actually published now on this website, and you can submit some new company you think is actually reaching the threshold that was set by the law. The second example I wanted to show you is the way that you can actually make sense of open data by doing math. And in this case, it's very specific math. It's by using statistics. You may have heard of this investigation. It's Tennis Racket. It's well, it was published by BuzzFeed, and actually the guy behind the whole thing, I will go to it because he deserves it, John Templin, went through thousands and thousands of professional matches, and he, from the bookmakers' odds, he actually made the calculation of the matches that had a very unlikely outcome. He then studied them, took those that looked the most irregular, and using statistics, he could eventually point out the players, the places, and the type of matches that were the most likely to have been rigged. Then, as Aida said, that was only the first part of the investigation. The second was to check everything that the data pointed out. That's what I'm used to call the treasure map effect. Most of the time, when you get good open data pointing interesting topic at you, you have to look it in the real to actually get some sense of it and be sure that what you say is actually relevant and that you are pointing at some interesting facts. My third example is a little more, well, light, so to speak. It's an excellent website called The Pudding, you may have known, and it's specialized in cultural topics, and it made a full investigation on the length of hair depending on gender across more than 80 years. So from the 1930s to the year 2010, they studied actual public data set of US high school yearbook. You can see it. It was published by Berkeley University, and it's usually used to recognize faces. And what they did is they actually put up a lot of efforts in order to extract the hair from every single picture and make some arrangement and analysis to know the length of the hair. So as you may see, there's a big raise and a peak, so to speak, in the 1980s of the length of the men's hair, whereas the peak is at the end of the 1980s for women's hair. And they face some very interesting issues like what about the mullets? So they indeed made a specific algorithm to find the shape of mullets, because mullets are long hair and not short hair, just short on the side and long on the back. And they made some machine learning algorithm to learn from it that is indeed absolutely not a joke. You can see here they had a very comprehensive work, and as you can see here, they had some mullet problem here, and they made some hair mapping stuff. It's pretty incredible. You should look at it. It's very interesting, and that's the occasion to say that a lot of the projects I raise here actually document everything they did on GitHub. I will give you extra information in the documentation on how to document, how to share, what to explain, how to explain it, good documentation methods, etc., etc. But just to let you see the kind of thing that was said, for example, here is a tennis racket project, and as you can witness, the journalist made an incredible work in detailing every single step of his job, with the number of matches, the kind of method used, referencing everything. And he got here the notebooks. So it's all in Python, and you can get the full code and use it in Jupyter for those that are accustomed to this language. And on the other hand, you've got the big data of big hair, and you've got everything here from the important features in hair length, the hair mapping, so the infamous mullets and beehives to make math with the hidden long hair. And you've got even the gender trends, and you get even some example and some samples of data sets to help you make the machine learning yourself on other people's picture. So I had some exercise, some application I wanted to introduce, but I think we're a little short on time. But I advise you to go and see about Elvis. Elvis is a project that helps you create network from actual open data on tenders. And you start from a government or many governments, you go to companies and you can visualize contracts. It's very, very cool. It's very, very user-friendly. You just have drop-down menus and you can make incredible maps. And you have some example available in the gallery. Oh, not this time, but eventually if you poke around, no. Okay, so not this time eventually, but I advise you to look around. I could make some very interesting network on medical spending by the Croatian government across multiple years. And it's a way to see the potential. But of course, my main advice would be to go by yourself and try things on your topics. There are many data available, and your expertise will actually be the most useful tool to make sense of it. So I'm late, I'm sorry, but I'm very eager to answer your questions. And if I don't have the time, because I will have to leave in a matter of 10 minutes, I'll be glad to answer as many as I can through the GitHub projects, the GitHub repo, which is just over here, as I showed earlier, and in the README file, which is here, I already planned to have a special part in order to sum up the questions and gather the question and answer to them, whether now or later, if necessary.
Yeah, that's it. I think so. If you have a question, please do write them in the box there. And if they're somewhat more specific, there will be not be time now. Perhaps Sylvain will be able to reply to them later. I would like to hear again for a second Aida, because I think there's been I think this part on sharing data has been quite interesting, on sharing the process and sharing it in a way that is both human and machine understandable. Because sometimes I think that there's like both issues. So in a way, sometimes we as techie people like to say, I just want the code and I don't care about the others. But in terms of journalism, I think it's important to detail how the whole thing happened in a way that, in a way non-techie people can understand. So I think this is nice in both of the examples that Sylvain provided did offer. So you have some thoughts to share about data sharing the outputs of journalism, not only as an article, but as data that can be used by others, if there's some thought on this?
Yeah, so again, at the risk of sort of repeating myself over and over, for us, again, it always goes back to consequences, and it always goes back to the impact of sharing data at its various stages on both your audience and on then the sources from which you've acquired your data. And for us, ethically, we measure that according to those consequences. It's interesting, actually, one of the experts that we used on the MOOC, on the ethics and data journalism, was Kaelan Barr, who is the data projects manager at The Guardian. And The Guardian, unless there is any particular reason, i.e. protection of sources, or where information might have to be redacted, it is their policy to share data from its raw stage up until spreadsheet, and then it's visualization. And that's their standard policy, unless they have any particular cause for concern, either to protect their audiences or to protect their sources, as I say. They're also the course, and I do urge everyone to sign up for the course. It's free, it's available online, and all it does is provide you with some further ammunition in order to make those ethical decisions based on your particular case, as and when it arises. And there is also the course also brings up this kind of question of ownership of data, and what happens when you share data that isn't public, or that didn't begin as public data, and what that means and what the consequences are for that. And ensuring that if you are sharing data that you didn't acquire from a public, a government, or an international source, being sure that you inform the owner of that data, or the original source of that data, that you're using that data, and being sure that the amount of transparency that you're applying to that data is acceptable to the owner of that data, or the person who supplied you with that data. So again, it's about iteration, it's about going back and ensuring that every single step along the way up until visualization has taken on board the sort of consequences of how your process of producing a data-led story might have impacted at different stages on different people along the way. I also just wanted to also make one comment about visualization that we touch on in the course. And that is that, again, similar to traditional journalism, where we urge journalists not to get carried away with sensationalist headlines, and to think about the impact that had, and think about drawing a balance between acquiring an audience for your narrative or your story and ensuring that you aren't producing sensationalist journalism. And that applies very much in the visualization process for us as well. And it's very easy, I think, as data journalists to find these really innovative, creative visual tools that might make our data look, you know, fancy and engaging, but might also detract from what we are trying to say with our story, or sensationalize what we're trying to say with our story. So that's also a key point that we consider when we think about the sort of the process of visualization.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, sensationalism is not the kind of thing you think about when you talk about, you know, data visualizations, but there can be indeed sensationalism with data visualization. So yeah.
Particularly if you're working for a mainstream media organization, for example, you're producing a story for a mainstream media organization where the final visualization of your data will lead to a written or broadcast piece of journalism, basically. And it's there where we have to think about how we're visualizing our data at the final stage of data visualization before we go to the story, where audiences then returning back to how that data might be accessed.
Absolutely. So Sylvain, since we are short on time, do you want to wrap it up? Some final comments, thoughts?
Yes, really, I think that I'd be very glad to see what you've done with all this. So it's important, I think, to be open and to move toward this kind of methodology, because it's not only a matter of what we call open washing. It's not only being able to say it's open, it's also something very important. It's when we talk about open data, we often mention the decentralized calculation, meaning that with open data, many people can work on the same calculation at the same time and share the work in computer terms as well as in classical terms. And when you are open and when you actually take part of it, you're not doing this for your own. You're actually joining a broader movement that is working toward an ideal, but also toward improvement of the information standards in your country and abroad. And I think that it's also a way to work differently, and it really changed my way of working, to working openly and to share all this. So it's very important, and it helps us to question efficiently most of our practices as journalists. So if you dig in really and thoroughly, I think it can make you a better journalist in the end.
I think this is an absolutely excellent point, because I think at the beginning we're often afraid like to share like, oh, but I really like showing the others like how I did this, you know, data analysis, then maybe it's not so great, maybe, but you know, once you grow into this, when you feel that this is the right way to do things, then you appreciate like when others do, and actually it helps you get better. It helps the other work better, because it's easy, makes it much easier to learn from each other's. So this is absolutely great. And as Sylvain said, it's something that you grow into in a way, and it changes the way you think about your work. I think this is a great point. So I think that's it, Sylvain, if you didn't have anything to add. I think so. So, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sylvain. Thank you, Aida, for your comments. Thank you. I see that there's some activity in the chat. That's great. So to conclude, I mean, Sylvain promised he'll share all the slides, all the links, so everything will be on his GitHub, and we'll share the link with participants. I invite you to check out the MOOC. As Aida mentioned, that's a great quality content. The link was in the invitation. Perhaps we can